I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it.
The words were delivered without hesitation, without apology, and without any attempt to soften their meaning. Prince William looked across the palace room and declared, "Camilla will never rule where Queen ruled." In one sentence, the future king appeared to separate his father's wife from the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II, and everyone present understood that this was not merely a family disagreement. It was a declaration about power, memory, and the future of the crown. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William held his ground inside a closed senior royal briefing at Buckingham Palace. The meeting had been called to discuss a proposal granting Camilla authority over several offices, charitable networks, private rooms, and ceremonial traditions once directed by the late monarch. A senior royal briefing was a confidential meeting where leading family members and officials settled matters affecting duties, property, and public authority. The proposal mattered because control over those areas would shape how Elizabeth's legacy was remembered and who could speak in its name. Charles remained seated at the head of the table as his son's words entered the official meeting record. That written record was the formal account of decisions and objections raised during the discussion, meaning William's declaration could no longer be dismissed as anger spoken in private. The king's expression hardened. He understood that the prince had challenged more than Camilla's expanding influence. He had questioned his father's judgment as both sovereign and husband. Camilla kept herself still, but her hand tightened around a pen. She had spent years enduring suspicion, criticism, and comparison, yet this attack came from the man expected to inherit the crown. When she finally placed the pen down, the controlled gesture carried humiliation and fury. The queen consort knew William had drawn the boundary clearly enough that any retreat might now look like defeat. The disputed proposal reached deep into Elizabeth's former domain. It included her private audience room, where confidential meetings had once been held, her correspondence office, which managed sensitive letters, and a memorial foundation carrying her name. William believed these responsibilities must remain under the direct oversight of the sovereign, or heir, because they represented continuity, not personal reward. Anne changed the balance without raising her voice. The Princess Royal did not defend Camilla or soften William's statement. Instead, she asked that his objection be recorded word for word. Charles immediately understood the warning. His son may have entered the room with support stronger than anyone had admitted. Charles ordered William to remain behind as the meeting broke apart. Camilla closed the folder before her and refused to look at either man. But before Charles could demand an explanation from his son, the silence around the table revealed something even more dangerous. William was not standing alone. Behind William's statement stood three people carrying three very different versions of royal history. Charles saw a wife who had endured decades of condemnation. Camilla saw a position she believed she had earned through loyalty and patience. William saw the memory of two women, his grandmother and his mother, being pulled into a future neither could defend. The conflict was constitutional on paper, but inside the family, it was raw, personal, and nearly impossible to forgive. William carried the burden of being both heir and grandson. To him, Queen Elizabeth II represented discipline, restraint, and duty without complaint. Diana had taught him something darker. Palace authority could preserve order while silencing emotional truth. The heir was therefore defending more than rooms, archives, or ceremonial duties. He believed he was protecting two legacies from being reshaped by those who had survived them. Camilla carried a different wound. She had spent years beside Charles, accepted public hostility, and taken on the responsibilities of queenship. The role of queen consort meant the monarch's wife, supporting the sovereign without inheriting his constitutional power. Yet she could not understand why the institution expected her to bear the pressure of that position while denying her the influence traditionally connected to it. To her, William's boundary sounded less like protection and more like permanent exclusion. Charles felt the family closing around him. Inside a private antechamber, he removed his glasses and placed them beside the meeting papers. The king asked William whether the declaration had been designed to humiliate Camilla. His voice remained controlled, but the question carried anger and pain. He had spent years asking the country to accept his wife. Now his own son appeared to be rejecting her authority from inside the palace. William answered without raising his voice. Humiliation had never been the purpose, he said, but surrendering Elizabeth's legacy simply to avoid discomfort would be worse. The prince paused when he mentioned his grandmother. His restraint tightened, because memory had entered the argument, and memory could not defend itself. Anne had already warned him in a private documented briefing. The Princess Royal explained that the transfer would allow Camilla's household to influence appointments, archive access, commemorations, and public messages linked to the late Queen. That reach mattered because whoever controlled those decisions could slowly redefine what Elizabeth's reign represented. Catherine knew the objection was coming. Before the meeting, she helped William shorten his statement and removed harsher references to Diana. The princess understood that one mention too many would let officials dismiss him as a wounded son rather than hear him as the future king. Camilla later faced Charles alone and asked whether he had known William was preparing to oppose her. The monarch hesitated. That silence answered more than words could have done. Yet William had not awakened that morning and suddenly chosen rebellion. One specific moment had convinced him that silence would become surrender. The crisis began 3 nights earlier, not in a council chamber, but outside a room that had remained untouched since Queen Elizabeth II's death. William arrived at Windsor expecting a quiet memorial review. Instead, he found the late monarch's private audience room unlocked, her desk cleared, and Camilla's household secretary directing staff where new files would be placed. That single moment transformed a disagreement over protocol into something William believed was an invasion of memory and the point of no return. William had been assured that the room would remain preserved until the family agreed on its future. The memorial initiative was a planned program intended to protect Elizabeth's charitable legacy, personal records, and public service after her death. Yet when the prince arrived, the door stood open. 2 staff members were carrying archival boxes away while Camilla's private secretary explained that the space was being prepared as a working office for the Queen's legacy program. William stepped inside and saw that Elizabeth's familiar red dispatch box had disappeared from the desk. A dispatch box was the locked case used to carry confidential state papers to the sovereign. He ordered everyone to stop. No tears came. His grief emerged as controlled fury, sharpened by the belief that someone had crossed a boundary they had no right to touch. Camilla entered before the staff could leave. She told William that the room could not remain frozen forever, and argued that using it for work connected to the late Queen would keep Elizabeth's service alive. The prince answered that preservation was not paralysis. No one, he said, had the authority to occupy the monarch's private space before the family reached a formal agreement. Anne arrived minutes later and examined the transfer order. The Princess Royal discovered that Charles's household had given preliminary approval, meaning permission granted before every required review was complete. The heir had not seen it. The Royal Archives, the institution responsible for protecting historic royal records, had not approved it. Neither had the memorial trustees, the officials legally responsible for overseeing the initiative. William opened the planning folder and found something far larger than one room. The proposal placed several Elizabeth-era offices, charitable operations, commemorations, and correspondence systems under Camilla's supervision. Windsor was not an isolated mistake. It was the first visible step in a wider consolidation of influence. William closed the room himself and returned the key to the castle custodian, the official responsible for managing access to protected areas. He then told Anne he would challenge the entire proposal at the next senior royal briefing, even if Charles called it disloyalty. 3 days later, when father and son finally faced one another without advisors between them, the unlocked room at Windsor became the accusation neither man could escape. The door closed, the aides disappeared, and for several unbearable seconds neither man spoke. Charles stood beside the long table, wounded pride hardening his face. William remained near the window, refusing to withdraw a single word. What followed was not a formal exchange between sovereign and heir. It was a collision between a father demanding loyalty, a son protecting memory, and two men who understood that the crown would one day belong to only one of them. Charles dismissed the remaining secretaries and ordered the chamber sealed from interruption. The sovereign was the reigning monarch, while the heir was the person next in the constitutional line to inherit the throne. Yet neither title could protect them from what had become painfully personal. The king insisted that Camilla could not be treated as temporary or secondary after becoming queen. Meaningful authority, he argued, would prevent the monarchy from appearing divided and would prove that her position carried substance rather than ceremony alone. William moved a chair aside instead of sitting. The gesture told Charles that this would not be reduced to an ordinary family disagreement. Status did not grant ownership of Elizabeth's legacy, the prince replied. His grandmother's private rooms, correspondence, charitable structures, and commemorations belonged to the continuing institution, not to whichever household gained access first. Protecting unity, he warned, could not mean surrendering boundaries simply because enforcing them caused discomfort. Charles struck where the wound was deepest. He accused his son of allowing Diana's memory to shape official judgment. William's restraint nearly broke. The future king answered that his mother had taught him what happened when the institution protected appearances while dismissing pain. He was not repeating her grievances, he said. He was refusing to repeat the system that had buried them. William then revealed how far he had already gone. Anne, Catherine, and independent trustees had been asked to review the proposed transfers. Trustees were officials responsible for protecting an organization's purpose, property, and legal obligations. Charles realized that his son had not entered the meeting alone in principle. He had built a coalition before delivering the challenge. William placed the Windsor authorization timeline before him. The documented sequence showed that Camilla's office had begun preparing Elizabeth's room before the heir, archives, and memorial trustees granted full approval. Charles stared at the dates. He had believed the proposal remained preliminary. Instead, action had begun under the shelter of his unfinished consent. Charles warned that blocking Camilla would carry consequences for the structure of the royal household. William turned toward the door, paused, and answered that the structure might be exactly what needed to change. That threat did not weaken William's resolve. It forced him to reveal the quiet network of people already preparing to stop Camilla's authority from expanding. William's declaration sounded spontaneous, but behind it stood weeks of quiet preparation. Anne had examined the precedents. Catherine had weighed the human cost. Trustees had studied the language line by line. What Charles first saw as an emotional outburst was actually a carefully constructed barrier around Queen Elizabeth II's legacy. Yet the most dangerous force behind the decision was not a document or committee. It was the shared belief that the monarchy could no longer survive through silence and private accommodation. Anne had traced every disputed responsibility to its source. Some duties had belonged personally to Elizabeth, others passed automatically to the reigning sovereign, while a smaller group could be reassigned only through formal approval. A precedent was an earlier decision used to guide what could legally or institutionally happen next. Her review showed that Camilla's office possessed no automatic right to inherit the private rooms, archives, patronage structures, or commemorative powers now under dispute. Catherine supported a clear separation between service and control. She believed Camilla should continue leading causes she had built through years of work. But that commitment did not justify absorbing Elizabeth's entire legacy structure. The princess understood the human cost of that boundary. The Queen would feel rejected, Charles would feel challenged, and William would be accused of reopening old wounds. Yet allowing authority to expand through silence would create a far deeper crisis later. Anne confronted William with that cost, inside a private sitting room. The Princess Royal warned that opposing Charles could permanently damage the relationship between father and son. William admitted that he feared becoming a son who fought his father, but he feared becoming a king who had failed to defend institutional boundaries even more. The heir knew affection could not replace accountability, simply because the truth was painful. Catherine found him alone after midnight, still holding the draft prepared for the briefing. One page contained his most personal references to Diana and the suffering he believed palace silence had caused her. She removed it. The future queen told him that the strongest boundary was one no one could dismiss as revenge. William resisted, then allowed the page to remain behind. The trustees soon issued a freeze order, stopping the transfer of Elizabeth-related offices until a new governance charter could be approved. That charter was the formal framework defining who controlled the memorial operations and how decisions would be reviewed. Anne proposed joint supervision by the sovereign, the direct heir, and an independent custodian. Charles would remain represented, but Camilla would gain no unilateral power. Camilla read the order twice, dismissed her staff, and requested a private meeting with William without Charles present. For the first time, Camilla would have to confront William, not as Charles's protected wife, but as the woman he believed had crossed a boundary drawn by two queens. The consequences arrived before the palace could control the story. Keys were recalled. Staff appointments were paused. The Windsor room was resealed. Then a single envelope reached Camilla's desk, confirming that the Elizabeth Memorial Program would no longer sit under her exclusive authority. She read the page in silence, folded it with deliberate care, and asked everyone to leave. Only after the door closed did the full meaning become clear. William's sentence had already begun changing the palace around her. Camilla's planned office expansion was suspended before midday. 3 legacy appointments were frozen, and Elizabeth's audience room returned to protected archival status. That status meant the space could no longer be altered or used without formal approval from those responsible for preserving royal history. Across the palace, departments received the same instruction. Every project using the late Queen's name now required consent from Charles, William, and the independent custodian appointed to guard the memorial program. Camilla sat alone with the folded order pressed against the desk. She removed her glasses and allowed the anger to settle into something more painful. Decades of service, endurance, and public judgment now seemed insufficient in the eyes of the future king. The queen consort had believed loyalty would eventually become trust. Instead, William's boundary made her feel as though acceptance had always carried a hidden limit. Charles entered after the staff had gone. Camilla asked whether he intended to reverse the decision. The king hesitated before admitting that overruling every safeguard would create a deeper crisis and make the household appear willing to ignore its own controls. His answer struck harder than refusal. She reminded him that he had once promised she would never again stand outside royal protection. Charles tried to explain that protection could not mean unchecked authority, but she heard only abandonment. Camilla then learned through a documented internal briefing that several senior aides supported the freeze. They feared her expanding household would blur the distinction between the reigning queen consort and Elizabeth's unique historical authority. The concern was not that Camilla lacked value, it was that one queen's present role could not be allowed to absorb another monarch's memory. William accepted her request for a meeting, but imposed one condition: no Charles, no secretaries, no prepared notes. The prince wanted the dispute stripped of rank and reduced to its human truth. Camilla agreed, though the absence of ceremony left her exposed. Before leaving, she removed a royal brooch associated with Elizabeth and placed it on her dressing table. The gesture acknowledged what words had not. She could not ask William for honesty while appearing to claim his grandmother's symbolic place. When William and Camilla finally sat opposite one another alone, neither could hide behind ceremony, and the anger between them gave way to something far more difficult: honesty. There were no aides, no minutes, and no polished phrases waiting on the table. Camilla entered without the brooch she had worn earlier. William remained standing until she sat, then placed his prepared notes aside. For the first time since the crisis began, they spoke not as queen and heir, but as two people shaped by the same broken family. The turning point did not come through victory. It came when Camilla asked the question William had spent years avoiding. Camilla had chosen a small sitting room at Clarence House because it carried no direct connection to Elizabeth, Diana, or the machinery of royal government. Clarence House was the London residence used by Charles and his wife for private and official work. In that neutral space, William clarified that he had no intention of stripping her of present dignity. His objection concerned authority that had belonged uniquely to the late monarch, and could not simply pass into another household through assumption. Camilla looked directly at him, and asked whether he would ever see her as anything other than the woman connected to Diana's suffering. The question cut through every prepared argument. William admitted that he could not erase the past, nor pretend it had left no mark upon him. Yet the prince insisted that the decision was not revenge. It was an attempt to prevent old patterns from repeating silently under the protection of tradition. Camilla then confessed what entering Elizabeth's room had meant to her. She had seen it as proof that the family finally accepted her completely, not merely as Charles's wife, but as a permanent part of the monarchy. William understood the wound beneath the ambition, but his answer remained firm. True acceptance, he said, could not require occupying another woman's place. Respect gained through displacement would always carry the shadow of the person removed. Camilla revealed that Charles had encouraged the expansion because he feared she would become marginalized after his reign. The king believed his wife might lose influence the moment William inherited the crown. Her hunger for authority had therefore grown from something more vulnerable than pride: the fear of becoming disposable once the man protecting her was gone. William offered a compromise. Camilla would retain control of her charitable program and public initiatives. Elizabeth's rooms, archives, memorial foundation, and private traditions would remain separately governed under independent oversight. Neither side would claim everything. Neither would leave empty-handed. Camilla accepted the boundary and agreed to make that acceptance visible. The following morning, she would stand beside William as the palace announced the settlement. Their agreement ended the private battle, but once the palace released the statement, the argument belonged to millions who saw William's words as either cruelty, courage, or the first sign of a new reign. By sunrise, William's sentence was no longer confined to palace walls. It dominated television screens, newspaper stands, radio discussions, and the crowds gathering outside royal gates. Some heard a son defending his grandmother. Others heard Diana's memory speaking through the future king. And some saw a public humiliation of Camilla that reopened wounds the monarchy had spent years trying to close. Yet one image outside Windsor captured the country's reaction more powerfully than every headline combined. The palace released a formal clarification before the morning broadcasts could harden speculation into fact. Queen Elizabeth II's private rooms, archives, memorial foundation, and personal traditions would be protected under a new joint charter rather than transferred to Camilla's household. A joint charter was a formal agreement dividing authority between named officials and setting clear limits on how decisions could be made. The arrangement mattered because it preserved the late monarch's unique legacy while preventing the dispute from becoming an open rejection of the present queen. William appeared beside Camilla for the announcement. The prince spoke first, explaining that remembrance could not be inherited like property. She then confirmed that protecting Elizabeth's legacy was not a judgment upon her own years of service. Camilla's words were measured, but the cost behind them was unmistakable. She had accepted a boundary before the nation, and William had accepted the responsibility of standing beside the person most wounded by it. Charles watched the broadcast from a private room and said nothing when it ended. The settlement protected the crown from a deeper institutional fight, yet the king understood what had changed. His son, not he, had defined the moral meaning of the crisis. William had drawn the limit Charles had hesitated to impose, and public approval made that truth impossible to ignore. Catherine found him after the cameras withdrew. William lowered his eyes, carrying none of the triumph others expected. She touched his arm and reminded him that a necessary boundary could still injure people on both sides. The future king had protected memory, but protection had not spared Camilla humiliation or Charles grief. A major newspaper captured the drama beneath the headline, "The Queen's rooms will remain hers." Its front page showed William securing the Windsor audience room door, while Anne stood beside him. Outside the castle, mourners placed white flowers beneath a handwritten card declaring, "One queen's memory does not diminish another woman's service, That message became the symbol of dignity without erasure. Charles summoned William that evening for one final meeting. He would not overturn the settlement. He had to decide whether their relationship could survive it. The country had delivered its judgment, but the monarchy's final verdict would be decided in a quiet room, where Charles had to choose between wounded authority and the son who would inherit everything. The final meeting contained no shouting and no demand for surrender. Charles stood beside the same table where William had made his declaration, but the fury had drained from the room. Camilla's authority had been limited. Elizabeth's legacy had been protected. The public had heard more truth than the palace intended. What remained was the deepest question of all. Had William divided his family to defend the crown, or had he finally drawn the boundary that allowed the monarchy to survive its own history? Charles confirmed that he would approve the new legacy charter. The charter was the formal agreement defining who could control Elizabeth's private rooms, archives, memorial institutions, and ceremonial traditions. Those responsibilities would now remain under the shared oversight of the sovereign, the heir, and an independent custodian. The arrangement mattered because it protected historical memory from becoming household property while ensuring that future decisions could not be made by one person alone. Camilla would lose neither her title nor her public dignity. She would continue leading her charities and standing beside Charles as queen consort, the monarch's wife who supports his reign without inheriting his constitutional authority. Yet the settlement drew a permanent line. She could serve the present without becoming the owner of every space, tradition, and power once connected to Elizabeth. Charles faced William and admitted that his declaration had wounded Camilla and exposed a division the family had tried to hide. The king wanted his son to understand the damage caused by speaking so openly. William accepted responsibility for the pain, but he refused to apologize for the boundary. Silence, the prince answered, would have protected appearances while allowing the disputed authority to become permanent. Charles then confessed what had driven him. He had expanded Camilla's influence partly to compensate for the years when she had been condemned, excluded, and treated as though she would never truly belong. William finally understood that his father had not acted only from ambition. He had acted from guilt. That understanding softened the anger between them, but it did not change the decision. Charles revealed one final truth from a documented private conversation with Elizabeth. She had once warned him that future queens must build their own service rather than inherit another woman's identity. The monarch had buried that memory because it complicated the future he wanted for Camilla. William asked that Elizabeth's warning be entered into the official governance record. Charles agreed, closed the file, and admitted that protecting continuity sometimes required denying the wishes of the reigning sovereign. The crisis ended without triumph. Camilla remained beside the king. Elizabeth's symbolic realm remained protected. Charles accepted the limit, and William accepted its emotional cost. When William said, "Camilla will never rule where Queen ruled," he was not declaring that she had no place within the monarchy. He was declaring that no crown, no marriage, and no act of royal will could make one woman's history belong to another. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.